Jeez, we back in the building. You know who it is. It's your boy Schiffer. Shout out to all listeners, all viewers. Yeah, this is Peniros Mind. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. And just to let you know, people, we got the super chat now. So anyone who wants to go into the super chat, you want your comments jumping up on the screen and all that good stuff, you know what to do. You hit that super chat, you send a little donation, and you get through that way. But I'm not going to do a long thing explaining too much about today's history lessons and what I'm going to be talking about. First and foremost, I'm going to not waste any time with you guys. I'm going to go to a slight music interlude. Yeah. What we're going to do, we're going to warm up the show with a little bit of your boy Schiffer. Yeah. So let me share my screen real quick. Let me get this up. All right. Let's share that audio. Let's get this. Yeah, baby. So, yeah, we're going to go to a slight interlude of your boy Schiffer and Motion. So out to Motion. Big up Motion on this track right here, because this is a big track. I'm going to put myself on mute so you guys can hear it properly. And then we're going to go into a short presentation of some videos. And, yeah, we're just going to discuss these videos and do a little bit of a reaction kind of type video, as well as, you know, break down some of the information in them. So without further ado, let's get it. Out to Motion, out to Professor G, out to the whole camp. You know what time it is.
Moon and the stars, Venus to Mars, interstellar craft, come floating with the gods, live in the mirage, the beat of my heart, be the engine to my soul when I drive no cars, fly no planes, down never grounded, drive through the rain, light through the dark, cold in the heat, heal through the pain, blood on the streets, love through the hate not to love, just another day I'm getting grace from above, I started when I stopped, righted my wrongs, brought courage to my fears, put my life in the song. The fire's in my eyes, so they kinda stay far from my heart. Carter, I pray hard as the spark. And my jab is way harder than Marvin. The hacker's great, but I'm on the par with my humble.
Say your thoughts,
Path to the mind,
look into yourself, and it's vast what you find.
mind and the body,
Spirit and the soul.
life is a test. What's next to behold?
Life is a gift,
Work is the pain,
back and forth on the rails like a train.
drives you insane.
Stained with the blood,
Most people say that they do it for the love.
mind drifting like the clouds overhead, traveling through time while I'm lying in my bed. I'm seeing all the things that I've done, what I've said, seeing people from the past that have crossed now are dead. I spoke to my mother and the words that she said had me feeling like I was on the road to revenge. Falling out with peeps that were supposed to be friends, realized certain man wasn't close to begin. Praying for a win, prepared for a loss, some straight from the path, but we stayed on the course. Return of the Jedi, same as before, demonstrate for the lost ones, playing with the force, playing with your life. Life's not a game, take pride in the youth and grow through the change. Good times, bad ones, go through the pain, elevate via signals that go to the brain.
Food for your thoughts,
Path to the mind,
look into yourself and it's vast what you find.
mind and the body.
Spirit and the soul,
Life is a test, what's next to behold?
life is a gift.
Work is the pain,
Back and forth on the rails like a train,
drives you insane.
stained with the blood.
Most people say that they do it for the love.
Nah,
Food for your thoughts,
path to the mind,
look into yourself and it's vast what you'll find.
mind and the body.
Spirit and the soul,
Life is a test. What's next to behold?
life is a gift,
Work is the pain,
back and forth on the rails like a train.
drives you insane.
Stained with the blood,
Most people say that they do it for the love. Nah, food for your thoughts,
path to the mind,
vast what you find.
body.
Soul,
What's next to behold?
gift
Pain
on the rails like a train.
drives you insane.
The blood,
Do it for the love.
nah,
Food for your thoughts.
Yeah, path to the mind. Mind in the body,
Spirit in the soul. Life is a gift.
work is the pay.
Yeah, big up to my brother Motion, man. Big track there. All right, we're going to get that screen share off the screen now. So out to everyone listening, yeah, we want you to open your minds today, yeah? That's what we want you to do. Yeah, I want you to open your minds. I want you to take in some information today. That's all we're asking from you. We're asking for a lot, you know. I'm going to do another screen share now. Let me make sure I got the right one up first. All right, there. Let's make sure we got the right screen shares because we don't like mistakes around here. So let's get this right on the right spot as well. Here we go. Out to all viewers, all listeners. Out to everyone in the chat. Big up yourselves. If you hit the super chat, big you up even more. We're not really going to be doing a lot of like guests, like stuff like we're not going to be having like, you know, a whole panel all the time of people shouting and screaming at each other, you know. But if people have got sensible questions, I may invite you onto the panel. Out to Bronag. No, this isn't my channel, but you know, we work together. This is my boy Peniros Minds channel. Like, share, and subscribe. You know, you can find your boy Schiffer over here anytime. Yeah. But if you got sensible questions, you know, put your questions in the chat. If I think it's sensible and you announce to me that you want to jump on the panel, then I'll send you the link privately. We can do it via email, stuff like that. Yeah. Or, you know, we'll work out a way. But I'm just not going to have every and anyone on the panel just chatting rubbish. I'm just not going to do it. Don't make sense. So without further ado, we're going to hit the screen share. Let's do this. Here we go. Make sure we get the right one. Here we go. All right. I'm sure we at the right place. Share audio as well. Are you ready to do this?
Apprenticeship system. This system was put in place to bridge the gap between slavery and complete freedom. It was a period during which masters still existed and slaves were called apprentices. They were to get along with each other in a society where both would be free. The apprentice had to work for their former masters for 40.5 hours per week without pay. In their free time, they could work for wages. Pradial or field slaves were to work for 6 years, while other slaves worked for 4 years. Only children under the age of 6 were completely free. The apprentices were still entitled to clothes, food, housing, medical attention, and ground provision from their former masters. Britain, in a bid to ensure these laws were enforced, assigned overseers known as stipendiary magistrates. However, a fateful day in 1838 would put an end to all of this.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to find the mute button there. I hope everyone took that in. Let me just pause this. Yeah, I hope everyone took that in. Yeah, because that's powerful. You know, even after slavery is done, yeah, people are forced to do what? To work in apprenticeships. Talk to me. Who knew about this? Is this known to a lot of people? You know, because I've heard a lot of people say slavery weren't that bad, and you know, the slave owners seem to have still retained slaves even after slavery was abolished to some extent. You know, 40 hours of free labor, you know, it's nothing to, you know, to scoff your or to screw up your face about. Yeah, and act like it's nothing. Basically, that's something that's very significant. 40 hours a week of free labor. Imagine yourself in today's modern day and age working for 40 hours a week for free. That's crazy. You call it slavery, I'd imagine. You know, same way, you know, a lot of things that we look at historically, you know, we could say that they were atrocities, but at the time they were accepted by people. You know, at the time it was acceptable for people to act a certain way, to talk a certain way, to be a certain way. Out to Latoya, big up Latoya. Sis, if you want to jump on the panel, yeah. I don't know if P's got your email, if he can email it to you, if you could send him a message, if you do want to jump on, and you can definitely get the link. But I just want to just refresh everyone's memories from our last show. We don't do any swearing over here, any type of bad language. We're not over here for arguments. We're not over here to start any kind of war in it. We're just over here to have a sensible conversation and share some information. So without further ado, I'm going to go to my next screen share, which is, here we go. Let's get this up. And out to Mrs. Elronda. Yeah, what this is about is we're just sharing information over here. We're just looking at some history, looking at some stuff, and just, you know, taking in some stuff. So where was the next screen share now? Let's make sure we get the right one, because we don't want to show you the wrong one, do we? That wouldn't make sense. There we go. You ready for this?
On the 1st of August 1834, the Slavery Abolition Act came into force in the United Kingdom, although it had received royal assent a year earlier. The Act outlawed slavery throughout the British Empire, although there were still some exceptions, such as in areas under the control of the East India Company. Although Parliament had outlawed the slave trade itself in the Slave Trade Act of 1807, that act only served to stop the creation of new slaves. It did not address the issue of existing slaves already working in the colonies. It was these existing slaves that the new act sought to address, and although it did abolish slavery, the impact took a long time to be felt. A key problem facing the government was what to do with the former slaves. The Act addressed this issue by stating that former slaves over the age of 6 became apprentices and then continued to work on largely the same plantations in largely the same conditions as before. Many of them were only fully emancipated 6 years later in 1840. The former slave owners themselves were also dealt with in the Slavery Abolition Act. It's important to remember that the Act effectively stripped slave owners of their property. The logic therefore went that the slave owners needed to be compensated for this loss of property, so the Act established the Slave Compensation Commission, who awarded the equivalent of £17 billion in today's money, funded entirely by the taxpayer, to 46,000 slave owners. A searchable online database of every slave owner who was awarded compensation is now available to view and to search online.
So I hope everyone took that in. You know, this is fact. This is available information to search online. So the fact that people don't know it is just because they're not looking. That's the truth. You know, if people were looking for this kind of stuff, you would find it. You know, if you were looking for the truth, you'd find it. That's the truth. You know, if you're not looking for the truth, you're just looking for the answer you want. You're just going to find the answer that you want. You know, so as you saw, you know, slavery was abolished in 1833. Yeah. But up to 6 years later, you know, people were still enslaved, having to work 40 hours a week for free. You know, so that's something that I found very interesting when I found this information, you know, and I thought I was just going to present stuff like, you know, just documents, online documentation or writing. But I think that gets a bit boring just listening to me narrate stuff, you know, and just reading books. So I thought, you know what, do a little video or find a video on the subject so you lot can take it in that way. But I'm not going to even waste time. I'm going to go to my next video. Give me 1 second. I hope everyone can see this now. I hope you're ready for some of this. This one's going to be slightly longer. It's not very long. It's not extremely long. Hopefully your attention span's long enough to last for, hold on, I'll tell you exactly how long. This is 20 minutes long. I'm not going to be playing all of it. I'm playing from 2 minutes 15 in. I'll probably play about 5, maybe 10 minutes of it. We can kind of clip it a little bit as well, because we don't have to go through the whole thing. So we'll just clip it a little bit. All right, let's go.
The mythology of the city is resplendent in their scarlet cloaks, gold-tipped canes. But these guys are certainly, you know, major figures in the development of Glasgow. When people think of the merchant city today, they think of coffee shops, nice pubs, restaurants. It's a nice, cool quarter of the city. But my job is uncovering what these merchants actually did. Who were these merchants? How did this come to be? 10 years ago, I started research in this area, and I eventually was published in a little book called It Wasn't Us. Almost immediately, I started giving tours of historic Glasgow, essentially tours revealing Glasgow's connections with New World slavery. There are many areas today in the merchant city that have a distinctly colonial flavour. This is us standing in front of St Andrews in the square, and for a short period, this would have been the most fashionable place for these merchants to live before they eventually moved westwards. As you can see, it's a fantastic example of mercantile extravagance. They've got the connections to import the Spanish mahogany, and they have the masons, Mungo Naismith, and others who are making sure that this place is one of the most fantastic churches in Scotland. So these tobacco.
So everyone who's wondering why I'm showing you this, you know, this is what slavery built. This is what the money from slavery built. This is what I'm showing you now. And this is just in Scotland we're looking at right now. We're going to move on to England afterwards.
Lords, the town council, dominated by these merchants at the time, they're very much making a statement about the development of the city. 1740 to 1790, this is known as Glasgow's golden age of tobacco. More tobacco is imported at Clyde ports than all the other English ports put together. So if you can imagine that tobacco really dominates the global economy at the time, and the Glasgow merchants are at the top of that, you're seeing Glasgow really is at the centre of the world. So Glasgow undergoes rapid phases of development whilst dependent on the slave economies. The fantastic churches, the fantastic townhouses, they're putting money into industry, they're putting money into banks. These guys are behind the development of modern Glasgow. Glasgow's motto is, of course, let Glasgow flourish. But I don't think it's too controversial to say that New World slavery helped Glasgow flourish. But then the West India merchants.
So there you have it, from the man's mouth himself, not from my mouth. Slavery of the New World helped Glasgow to flourish. From a Scottish man, not from Schiffer, not from some randomer, from their own people, from their own corner of the world, on their own tour guide. Let's go. Let's get the rest of this.
They call themselves the sugar aristocracy. Right. New money. So just like the tobacco lords, they have a self-appointed title with delusions of grandeur. The tobacco lords, the sugar aristocracy. We're now in Glasgow Cathedral, sometimes known as the High Kirk. This is the medieval heart of Glasgow, and perhaps the most sacred place in the city today. So I'm standing on the burial tomb of Richard and Alexander Oswald, as you can see here. This is in between the 8th and 9th nave. They're the only mercantile family to be afforded this privilege to be buried in Glasgow Cathedral. This is the most sacred heart of the city, but it's only where your most prominent dignitaries and politicians of the day would have been buried. So this was a very rare honour for two merchants to be buried here. It's perhaps ironic that these two merchants, perhaps slave traders, are buried in the sacred heart of the city. We're a real mercantile dynasty in Glasgow, and Richard Oswald is one of the leading authorities on the slave trade in Glasgow in the 1720s. The Oswalds also have another link to perhaps the most infamous of all Scottish slave traders. Richard Oswald of Auchencruive is a nephew of the two uncles buried here.
We're standing in front of Oswald Hall in Ayrshire, and this is a very important house historically.
We acquired this from the Agricultural College just over 4 years ago.
I can see you've got Richard Oswald on the right.
Yes.
This house is his. He bought it in about 1764. He died in this house, and his wife died here too. You can imagine them coming down that wrought iron staircase out in this garden in the summer's days like today. I think the irony and the contrast is we're standing in this magnificent building and we're looking out on this magnificent sort of garden where they probably had parties, and at the same time people were being beaten to death in the Caribbean. Richard Oswald went to Jamaica and bought an island just outside Sierra Leone called Barnes Island. And from that island, the Oswald bought and sold slaves, as if it were like a supermarket.
The Scots constructed a golf course on Barnes Island. They dressed the enslaved people on the island in tartan that had been imported from Bannockburn and from Glasgow, and they used these enslaved people as caddies on the golf course.
The wood on top of that door is pine wood from Jamaica, actually carved into local Scottish pine. So in a way, symbolically, it's sort of bringing the past and the present together. I think it's very important, the work that you've done to restore it and to even get back some of the paintings which were taken to America, because this house reflects not only Scottish history, it is British history, it is American history, it is Jamaican history, it's African history. A wee boy from Glasgow, looking at this house, one may say he did very well, but he did it buying and selling people. I think what it does say is that if you have what we call honest history, it tends to have a greater impact.
Yeah.
So when I go about Scotland giving talks on the Scottish Caribbean connections, as I call them, the main reaction is, why hasn't anybody told us this before?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this is I think it's been a collective failure for historians of this. I mean, this really is a golden age, because this has been almost an unknown history up to, I would say, maybe the last 20 years. What you're seeing now is a real new understanding and a new generation of scholars that are working on this.
Well, I'm in the Glasgow City Archives, which is located in the Mitchell Library in Glasgow. And we are here today to look up some of the archival material. Marinka Thompson-Odlum is the PhD student. So Marinka, you're doing a PhD, or you've done it?
I'm still in the process of doing it.
You're still in the process of doing it.
The subject, it fascinates me, being that I grew up in the West Indies. And sometimes, there's a place in St. Lucia called Glasgow, but never really thought about twice, like why it was called Glasgow. And my PhD is a joint venture between the University of Glasgow and Glasgow Museums. And so all these fabulous documents at the Glasgow City Archives really helped me kind of create a picture. You can see the number of ships that leave the various colonies in the West Indies and the amount of hogsheads. Just think of it as a barrel of sugar. So here you see in Jamaica, 19 ships leave and roughly 5,700 hogsheads of sugar is brought in. So, I mean, this is a huge endeavor.
So it was contributing to the economy of Glasgow.
Yes.
And to the so-called social and
because we have more people, we have more merchants moving here, setting up their businesses. So here we have a indenture, a mortgage between Robert and Archibald Sterling.
Okay.
And so it's for properties in Jamaica, but these slaves are also included.
So the property is mortgaged?
Yes.
And the mortgage includes the slaves
yep.
as part of it,
Yeah.
fair enough, because the slaves are the price.
Yeah, and they are property. So that's why you have them all included. So you have, it says here, cattle, stock, slaves.
What these documents do show is it is what we call now direct evidence. This is a history which is very much alive, because I'm a descendant of slaves, and so is Marinka. And therefore it is fascinating that is the descendants of slaves who are doing this research. And I'm hoping that when her PhD is completed, it will be available, because I think it will be really a fascinating piece of work, and the people of Glasgow will benefit.
I just think it's important to know where not only you come from, but where your country comes from, where the ideology and ideas that build up a nation.
Yeah, sorry about that, people. I did mean to stop that a little bit earlier, but you know, I hope you've picked up on a lot of the information that's been shared there. You know, just the amount of goods that were being transported, you know, from Jamaica to England, like masses and masses. The type of buildings that were being built off of the back of these industries, the type of people that were being built off the back of these industries, calling themselves sugar lords and tobacco lords and all sorts of titles. Yeah, so let me show you another part of this video that I found interesting. Let's go to about here.
He lived in, meaning Scotland, and that there was a difference. And when he was here, McCune Smith began to realize what it was like to live in a country that didn't have slavery within it, that he could live differently, that the psychological and the social pressures were so much less. So there almost certainly was racism, but nothing like what he'd experienced in America. So this is the list of all medical graduates of the university, covering a long period, probably the better part of a century. And so we'll find McCune Smith in 1837 when he received his third degree from Glasgow. So this is the record of his medical graduation, just a couple of months before he leaves for America, 1837, when he receives his third degree, the medical degree.
On his way back, he experienced racism from
the ship's captain, who was American, not wanting to allow him to travel in a cabin, but wanting him.
So what we're talking about here is a black man that came from America to Scotland, managed to get himself 4 degrees, was one of the top university students in his university. I think he was 4th out of however many students, you know, in his ability. Yeah. So he done really, really well. And even in him doing really well, he still faced a lot of racism, you know, and let's just get the rest of his story and then we can move on.
To travel with other people of color in the steerage, but his fellow students and the Emancipation Society wouldn't allow that.
Then he came to New York City, opened a pharmacy, and he continued that sense of social concern, of wanting to be at the forefront of whatever was possible for the average person.
He's really important as a medical innovator. He opens a pharmacy. He's the first practicing physician. He's the doctor for the colored orphan asylum. He's very well known and a really important abolitionist. He's the first secretary of the Radical Abolitionist political party, chairs their convention. The next time a black man would chair a national political party convention will be 125 years later. So he's very important, but I think he's forgotten for a number of reasons.
I really am extraordinarily proud to be his, what am I? I'm his great-granddaughter.
He's part white. His wife is part white. His children are even more white. Within 2 generations, they pass as white. They don't remember, either don't want to, or after a while don't even know of their black ancestry. It's not until his great-great-great-granddaughter in the early 2000s does some genealogy that she realizes, 1, she has a black ancestor, 2, it's a very famous abolitionist.
I don't know why I should care about being part of history, but I do. I knew we had a family Bible. It was huge. But there were pages in the middle that were all about us. I could recognize the names of my parents, then of my grandparents, then of my cousins, then even going further back to the 1700s in the Bible about my family. And that we could recognize who we were from. I'm trying to remember how it came that we discovered this. Oh, here we are. Okay. Weddings, James McCune Smith and Malvina Barnett.
In 2003, I was at my grandmother's house in Connecticut, and we were looking at the family Bible, and I noticed the name James McCune Smith, which sounded familiar to me. I did some research.
So there you have it, ladies and gents. I did it from that point in the video on purpose because I wanted you to think, who is this guy? I like your comment, P. Big up Valley Vision, big up Joel, Latoya, Samaya, Georgia Lynch, everyone in the chat. And I know a lot of people were thinking to themselves, who is this guy they're talking about? Yeah, so you just got the name there. I'll rewind it back for you a little bit. Is it McCune Smith? Let's go.
James McCune Smith, which sounded familiar to me.
There you go, James McCune Smith. So if anyone wants to go and look up James McCune Smith, yeah, black abolitionist. Yeah, we're not talking about Malcolm X here. We ain't talking about Martin Luther. We talking about James McCune Smith. Yeah, you need to know about these people, you know. That don't mean that Malcolm X ain't important. It just means that, you know, this guy might be just as important. We just don't know his name like that, you know. So we should know his name. Anyway, let me move on quickly. Bang.
I did some research over the next couple of months and found that he actually was my ancestor.
I think that people think I'm odd because I am as old as I am. 98? Am I 98? Yeah.
Let me get this right. It's Dr. James McCune Smith. Yeah. And as you notice, you know, his ancestor who we're seeing here on the screen, you know, she clearly is not what you would class as a black lady, but she's descended from a black man. Imagine that. Yeah. And she respects her history. Why do you think we're hearing about these things? Because people know the truth. It's out there. Can't hide it. It's impossible. It's absolutely impossible. So I'm going to the last video now. And after this one, I'm out. Hold on. Big up Melanated. Big up yourself. What did she say? That is sad to have your blackness completely washed away. It's crazy, but it is what it is, you know. People, you know, they fall in love with who they love. You know, they breed with who they breed with, and life goes on, man. That's what happens. But at least she's not a horrible person about her history and her heritage. She's accepting of it, and she, you know, she embraces that as part of herself by the sound of what I heard coming out of her mouth. So we're going to move on to the last video now, because I'm not sitting there all day. I've got other things to do. So let's just get it real quick, and then I can be move on to the last. Oh shoot, I didn't mean to do that. Did not mean to do that. All right, so here we go.
My name is Jay Draper and I'm a professional tour guide in London. One of the subjects I'm asked to talk about a lot in the course of my work is the transatlantic slave trade. You know, the trade in enslaved Africans between Europe, Africa and the Americas between 1500 and 1800 that resulted in the enslavement of 10 to 12 million people. Yeah, that. And something I've noticed is that when I'm talking to a group consisting entirely of white people, different questions come up than when I have a group with a single black person in. Questions which never get asked in front of a black person. Africans sold their own people into slavery. Why aren't you talking about that? What about the Arabs? What about the Irish? What about all the good stuff that Britain did? Why do you have to keep bringing up old history? Why is it only white people ask this stuff? I don't know. And I'm not saying black people never hear these questions, obviously. One look at Twitter will tell you they definitely do. I think people have a lot of questions about the slave trade. I don't blame anyone for not wanting to research this stuff themselves. It is extremely depressing. And I don't think you're racist for not being born knowing the answers. This is all stuff I wasn't born knowing, and I didn't pick up in school. And it's okay if you don't know this stuff either. But today I'm going to try and answer these questions in the best faith I can. This isn't going to be a comprehensive primer on the trade. These are just answers to some questions that I get a lot. And as you can see from the time bar, they take longer to unpack properly than I usually have at the end of a tour. Now, folks, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this subject. I haven't written any books or done any degrees on transatlantic slavery, but I do my research, I read a lot, and I've provided in the description my sources. And so if you'd like to contradict something I say, I'm happy to learn, but you're going to have to provide a good source for it as well. I don't expect you to believe me without evidence, and in return, please extend me the same courtesy. 2 more notes before we begin. There are some words that have historically been used to talk about Black people that we no longer use today. I'm not going to use them, but if they come up in historical documents, I will be showing them on screen. Also, I live and work in London, and so I talk about the trade as it relates to Britain and London specifically. I'm not going to be doing US stuff like the Founding Fathers, the Underground Railroad, or the American Civil War here. You guys need to figure that out on your own, okay? Good. What is the triangle trade?
I think everyone's kind of got a tone for what the video is about now. So she's going to go on to talk about the triangle trade, which is the trade of human trafficking in replacement for goods, of manufactured goods, not replacement, or in trade for manufactured goods with Africans, to then buy slaves from Africans, to then take them to plantations, to then take the sugar and the stuff that the slaves manufacture on the plantations back to Britain. Yeah, that's the triangle trade. So I'll let her go through that quickly, but I'm going to kind of start skipping through a little bit. So bear with me a bit.
So a quick primer on the transatlantic slave trade. Starting in the 15th century, Europeans used Africans as cheap slave labour on plantations in the newly colonised Americas. Millions of Africans are transported across the Atlantic Ocean. This trade is sometimes called the triangle trade because of how the routes of the ship look if you plot them on a map. Ships leave Europe with finished goods, trade them for people in Africa, take the Africans to plantations in the Americas, and take the products they grow, cotton, coffee, sugar, cocoa, tobacco, back to Europe. All, you will notice, luxury goods, not things we need. In Europe, the countries with the biggest involvement are the ones with the biggest colonies in the Americas: Britain, France, Holland, Portugal, and Spain, although other countries are involved too. The African slaving coast stretches from modern Senegal all the way right round South Africa to Mozambique, but most enslaved people are from West Africa, countries like modern-day Sierra Leone, Benin, and the Gambia.
All right, so that's a little bit of information to take home with you, but we're going to skip forward a little bit from there because I think there's some more crucial parts that we need to get into. But I wanted you to have a brief understanding of the triangle trade, so you got that. Let's keep it moving.
Did we have slaves in the UK? So we know there are enslaved people in Africa and the Americas, but surely the motherland herself is a paradise of liberty, unstained by the black mark of slavery. It doesn't happen here, does it? Well, obviously we don't have cotton plantations in the UK. We don't have the climate for growing coffee or sugarcane or tobacco on plantations with hundreds of enslaved people. Britain's plantations are not in Britain herself, but in the colonies in the West Indies like Jamaica. And that does make for a different relationship with slavery than, say, the US has. It's like a different flavour. Vibes are different. But does that mean there were no enslaved people in Britain at all? Well, no, not quite. Once the transatlantic trade gets up and running, of course some Africans make their way to Britain. Some are brought here by ship's captains as domestic servants, and some make their own way here as free people. Even Elizabeth I complains about the number of black people in London.
There are of late diverse black Moors brought into the realm, of which kind of people there are already here too many.
By the 18th century, it is considered very fashionable to have a black servant in your house, generally a young boy. Some of these people are sent to the plantations when they grow up, and sometimes they stay here. You'll often see them in family portraits, together with all the other expensive possessions like fancy silk dresses and silver jugs that show off how wealthy the family is. Now, in a painting, you can't always tell the difference between a paid servant and an enslaved person. Both are present in Britain, although if you see one wearing a collar, that's a pretty clear indication they aren't free.
All right, there you have it. Did slavery exist in Britain? Simple answer on your screen. I'm going to move on.
He was brought 5 years since. He's about 5'4" high, well made and very straight. Speaks English well and understands the business of a family footman.
So the status of these people is a bit of a legal grey area. Technically, we already had an abolition movement in England all the way back in the 11th century. Back then, there was a slave trade centred around Bristol, sending people across to Ireland, until a movement spearheaded by a bishop called Wulfstan turned opinion against the practice through his preaching, until slavery had basically died out by 1200. But there was never a law specifically outlawing it. The church banned it in 1102, but they don't have any actual legislative power, so there's nothing on the books specifically saying you couldn't own other people. But equally, unlike in Portugal and France, or indeed in British colonies, there isn't anything specifically saying you can either. There are some court rulings that indicate slavery might not be legal in England. For example, in 1701, the Chief Justice Sir John Holt rules that one may be a villain in England, that is, a serf, but not a slave. But given that people are openly advertising in the Daily Post for decades after that, it doesn't seem to have had much effect.
So when people say there was no slavery in Britain, that's what they're basing it on, falsified information. Because if we can find documents to show that people were advertised, bought and sold as slaves on British soil, there's no way it didn't happen here. You know, they're advertised in newspapers and all sorts of things, articles, all, like, come on, like, we don't need to even go deeper into that. I'm going to move on because we're almost done. Hold up.
Why didn't we just have the plantations in Africa? Wouldn't that have been easier? So this is actually a good question. So there are a few reasons why a slave owner might want to take you far from home. In fact, there are attempts to enslave Native American people, and it doesn't really work as well for the slave owners. Because if you're close to home, you're going to find it easier to escape. You're going to know the country better than the slave owners, and you're going to have friends who can come and free you. But if you're taken across a whole ocean, not only is it impossible for you to get home, you're also cut off from other people who speak your language and who share your culture, which is an important tactic for the slaver to make it harder for you to work together and form a rebellion. Can't Europeans just have the plantations in Africa? Well, Europeans aren't powerful enough to colonize Africa yet. They can't get very far into the interior of the continent without dropping dead from malaria or yellow fever, and Africa already has very powerful cities, states and empires that aren't going to be overturned just because some explorer in tights and a funny hat decides to plant a flag on their beach. The colonisation of Africa comes later, in the 19th century, after the slave trade ends in Britain. Only after millions of working-age people have been systematically stripped from its economy for hundreds of years is Africa weak enough to be colonised by Europeans.
Okay, so now everyone understands when they talk about Africa got invaded and colonized and taken over so easy. Oh no, it didn't. It took hundreds of years of stripping the youth from Africa, taking millions and millions of slaves and destroying the economies of that place, you know, because they didn't have young people to sustain it. They didn't have young working age people to sustain it. Simple. So I'm not even going to stay on that subject for too long. I'm just going to move on to the next part of the video because I ain't got a lot of time left, unfortunately. I think we're going to go from about... We're going to go from about here.
She writes her story for the Anti-Slavery Society called The History of Mary Prince. And Phyllis Wheatley is a young girl enslaved in Boston, Massachusetts. She is really smart, Within 16 months of arriving in America, she's fluent in English and she learns Latin and Greek too. By the age of 14, she's a published poet and does a book tour in England. Her book becomes the first published book written by an African-American woman. After she's freed, her poetry becomes decidedly abolitionist. But let's talk about how abolition plays out in Britain and its colonies, because there's a lot more to it than we freed all the slaves and then spent the next century spreading abolition around the world. The trade is massively profitable, so lots of really wealthy, powerful people are involved in it. Lots of members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords are slave owners. Slave owners run the dockyard industry and the banks. They don't go down without a fight. When slavery is abolished in 1833, the British government pays £20 million in compensation from the government for their loss of property. A huge amount, about 40% of the government's entire annual spending. When you outlaw something, you don't normally compensate the dealers. It's a measure of how tangled in slavery the British establishment is that we pay slave owners for owning illegal goods. In effect, Parliament buys the freedom of the enslaved people in its borders. We have to take on a huge amount of debt to pay this, and we don't pay that debt off until 2015.
So there you go, another fact that I thought was quite shocking. You know, within British borders, they bought the freedom of these enslaved peoples and had to pay for all of the slaves in the Caribbean or wherever to be freed, and the taxpayer has been paying that off since 2015. So technically, if black people have been here paying taxes too, you know, we taxpayers too, we've been paying for our freedom. Yeah, we never got no reparations, we paid. Get it straight. But let's continue.
Do the enslaved people get any compensation for their years of unpaid labor? Do they? Heck. The enslaved people on plantations aren't even allowed to leave and do what they like straight away. Instead, they're forced into what are called apprenticeships, where they have to stay on the same plantation doing the same work for a period of several years after abolition.
To the population throughout the island of Jamaica, you will on the 1st of August next no longer be slaves, but from that day you will be apprenticed to your former owners for a few years in order to fit you all for freedom.
And as we saw in the previous video, we know what those few years was. We're talking about 6 years, was probably the shortest period, but it is where it is. So let's just move on. Watch this. I don't want everyone to look at this picture here, yeah? Watch this. Let me draw it back a little bit so you see the full thing.
Idea of the inferiority.
All right, now watch this. This is the inferiority chart. Yeah, what you're gonna see at the top of this inferiority chart, yeah, that these things, people haven't seen this like in our time. This is ancient stuff. Well, not ancient, but it's old enough that they can hide it from most of the people of our generation. So you got what is this? Circassian chief, European, Greek, Circassian girl, Chinaman. I don't even think that's actually technically the right term to be calling someone a Chinaman, but they at the top, yeah. And watch what happens as we go down.
Of Africans doesn't go away either.
Yeah, in the middle we got Kamchakan, whatever that is, Kamchaktakan, Mongolian, Turk, Malay, Hindu, Polynesian. Yeah, and look at the Polynesian, even that, I don't know, I'm not sure. But either way, let's move down this chart. Then we start seeing, hold up, Zambian, Ethiopian, American Indian, yeah, Navajo, whatever you want to call them. That says Pawnee, yeah, Crow, and something else there.
Then, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Everyone thought.
So look how they put us in the same bracket. But I'm just going to let it ride out.
That way. You can't judge them by modern values. Not everyone thought that way. The enslaved people, for a start, plus all the abolitionists. This is a weirdly relativistic line of thinking, as if slavery is fine and slavery is abhorrent are just two different viewpoints. And without everyone around you telling which is correct, you can't decide between them. Of course you can. Why, of course you can, Osborne. We do this to people in the past all the time. We condemn the people who went to hangings for fun, and the ones who burned witches, and the ones who beheaded their wives. We don't say, oh, well, it was normal to crucify thieves back then. Your eagerness to avoid passing judgment in this specific instance is strange to me, and I wonder why that is. But yes, it was normal. For the first few hundred years of the trade, any abolition movement was pretty non-existent, meaning that statistically, if I was around during the 18th century, I probably would have thought it was all right to enslave Africans. That's a little bit scary. It means my views are probably greatly shaped by what people around me think is normal, rather than me rationally and independently coming to my own conclusions. What about the Irish? Sometimes people ask me why I don't talk about how the Irish were also enslaved in huge numbers, including children. Sometimes they even say that the Irish were the first to be enslaved in the Americas, that their treatment was even more brutal than that of the Africans, or that Irish slavery continued after the African trade was abolished. Well, here's what did happen. Many Irish people were in what's called indentured servitude. Indentured servants enter into contracts to work for someone in the colonies for a certain number of years, usually between 4 and 7. In return, they get passage to America, food and lodgings during their work, and a parcel of land when they finish. The idea is to attract new labour and new settlers to the Americas to work the land there and colonise it for Britain. Many people, both British and Irish, sign up for this, excited by the idea of becoming a landowner in the New World. The majority of indentured servants are English people who signed up willingly.
This indenture witnesseth that Eleanor White doth voluntarily put herself apprentice to Barclay and Mitchell of Philadelphia, unto the full end and term of 4 years.
Now you notice they call this the apprenticeship also. They do the same, like they take the same word and apply it to so many different things. So these black people are apprenticed, but they don't get paid. But when white people get apprenticed, they get paid. So when we want to talk about slavery, you know, I appreciate, you know, the way the woman broke it down as well. You know, there's a lot of white people that believe that white people were enslaved too. And they say a lot of stuff about black people that's quite derogatory in the sense of, you know, how come black people don't act like us? We was enslaved too. Let's get this.
To be computed from and after the arrival of said ship in Philadelphia. And her said master is assigned shall find unto said apprentice meat, drink, apparel, lodging, and all other necessaries befitting such an apprentice. And the said apprentice, at the expiration of said term, shall be entitled to and receive such corn, land, and so forth, as is usual by the custom of the country.
Certainly, the work is very hard, with a high mortality rate, and indentured servants are often treated badly, including whippings. Your master can set rules on where you can go and if you can get married. And worse, many people are forced into the situation. Indentured servitude is a legal punishment in England for criminals, orphans, and homeless people. And after Oliver Cromwell sweeps through Ireland in the 17th century, somewhere between 10 and 12,000 Irish people are forcibly deported as indentured servants to work on sugar plantations, although numbers are hard to judge because of lack of records. Now, if that happened today, we would probably call it human trafficking. But they do make up a legally distinct class from African chattel slaves, and under the law they do have more rights. Their service is for a limited period of time. They're supposed to be paid at the end of it. Unlike enslaved people, they're not allowed to be killed, and they can sue a cruel master for overly harsh punishment. Their children are not enslaved and can't be sold away from them. Most of all, they are not property. They are not owned. In fact, one of the reasons we know as much as we do about indentured servants is because they can take their masters to court, so they leave legal records behind. There is a particularly horrible case of one indentured servant called John Thomas, who is hung from his wrists with lit matches between his fingers, causing him to lose a lot of mobility in his hands. Such an abuse is so rare and shocking that Thomas is able to take his master to court and get him locked up. Thomas is freed, his medical expenses are paid, and he is given compensation for his injury. Enslaved people are legally property and cannot take their masters to court. A slave owner can legally kill an enslaved person in any way he sees fit, and some resort to the worst tortures you can think of in order to make an example of rebels. What happens to the Irish is horrible, absolutely, but it is a different thing to slavery. There is no need to exaggerate the horrors perpetuated on the Irish people. And if we're talking about the Irish relationship to the slave trade, it shouldn't be forgotten that, of course, there are Irish slavers too, like the slave ship captain David Toohey or slave owner Bishop Patrick Lynch. So where does this idea come from? Sadly, it's come from white nationalists. They love the idea that my ancestors were slaves too, and you don't hear me complaining. If these blacks can't make it in life, they must just be lazy. Shut the up with your cries and racial I'm Irish. We were slaves before you, and for longer, you lazy, ignorant humans. Do you hear us cry? Do we kill cops? No, we could bitch. Is the IRA here killing cops? No. They want you to think that slavery wasn't that bad, or it wasn't about race. It's also a very recent myth. The Irish historian Liam Hogan has done great work on unpicking this myth in minute detail, and he traces it back to a book written in 1993 by Michael A. Hoffman. Just so you know what kind of guy Hoffman is, he's been flagged by the Anti-Defamation League for his Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, and for claiming, among other things, that if Judaism ever becomes supreme in the United States, there will be a mass murder of non-Jews. So, not the guy you should be taking history lessons from, basically. And I am suddenly seeing this myth that was only invented in the last 30 years being repeated by my visitors as if it's a fact they've known all their lives. It worries me that this idea that started with Holocaust deniers and neo-Nazis has found its way down to Brenda and Alfred going for a lovely day out at the museum.
So yeah, I hope everyone took that in. You know, this whole idea is, you know, something that's only been around for, you know, around 30 odd years, you know, and it's a myth. It's not real, but some people are obsessed with these neo-Nazi ideas. So let's just continue. And it's funny because every time I hear people talk about all of this kind of rhetoric, they usually, you know, like go into this kind of Nazi kind of rhetoric. You know, they've got a problem with Jewish, they've got a problem with black, everyone. They've got a problem with everyone. So let's just keep going anyway.
I'm not saying you're a horrendous racist if you thought the Irish slave myth was true, but please take a second look at the person who told it to you and don't trust them again. Didn't the Africans enslave their own people? Africans do enslave other Africans, yes. Many of the African societies Europeans find are already deeply enmeshed in slavery. Typically, people who are sold into slavery are criminals and prisoners of war. If you commit certain crimes, you can be enslaved as a legal punishment. But at the height of the trade, gangs of slavers burn down villages and kidnap anyone they can.
So check that one out. Yeah, there was a slave trade in Africa before the Europeans got there. But before you could be enslaved, you would have to be a criminal of some type. Maybe it's like, you know, rapists, murderers, people like that was being enslaved. Or you would have had to be like some kind of war. It would have to be like from war, you know, so that people went to war and they captured their enemies, you know, and then they would have been kept as slaves. But I think I'm going to let her go on to explain the rest of what she's got to say. I'm not going to like do any spoilers. Let's just keep going.
Most people are enslaved violently. Africans are captured by other Africans and traded for goods like fabric or guns. Some West African states like Dahomey, the Oyo Empire and the Kong Empire grow very rich off the slave trade. But unlike the European countries that get rich, the Kong Empire doesn't exist today. Europeans didn't invent African slavery, but they are responsible for its massive growth, and they start the practice of forcibly uprooting people thousands of miles from home. I want to be careful here and stress that the intra-African form of slavery is not some enlightened, peaceful kind with happy slaves and kind masters. It also involves ripping people from their homes, breaking up families, physical violence, and unpaid labour. However, there is a particular flavour to the form of European slavery that distinguishes it from intra-African slavery. Most obviously, the European form involves the Middle Passage, the journey from Africa to the Americas. This involves being herded by people who don't speak your language into the lower deck of a ship with no more space than a man in his coffin. No windows, no light, and no facilities except a tub in the middle of the floor for at least 6 weeks. It is violent and terrifying, and the Middle Passage alone kills about 10% of the people who are forced to make it. It's hard to be sure about these finer distinctions in the historical record, but it seems like inherited slavery also isn't present in African societies before the arrival of Europeans. You might be enslaved, but your child isn't necessarily. On a Caribbean plantation, if you have a child, then that child doesn't belong to you. They belong to the slave owner, and they can be sold away or even killed for any reason with.
So I hope everyone heard that distinct difference there, because I was waiting for her to get to that part. I didn't want to do a spoiler. So what she's saying there is, you know, in Africa, if someone was enslaved as a war criminal or any kind of criminal or what, for whatever reason, that doesn't mean their children are enslaved. And another thing I want to point out as well is that slavery is not consistent of just enslaving people because of the color of their skin. You know, just because you're black, you're going to be enslaved. It didn't work like that. So I'm not saying it's good, but it's not the same. That's all I'm saying.
No repercussions. African slavery is also, obviously, not tied to skin colour. You aren't marked out as only fit for slavery by the colour of your skin. So it's easier for formerly enslaved people to reintegrate into society once they become free. Transatlantic slavery also has a completely different impact on the world we live in than African slavery. Although African slavers may have benefited in the short term, in Europe, the institutions that plantation money bought are still going strong today, whereas the African kingdoms that sold people into slavery are not. Whereas the trade strips wealth out of Africa, you can't deny Europe has done pretty well out of the slave trade. So if you're asking the question in good faith, that's the answer. But it would be wrong of me to pretend that everyone who asks about intra-African slavery asks because they're genuinely interested. It's always, what if the real racists are black? And it just smacks of trying to spread the blame and change the subject. Like, take the log out of your own country's eye first, people. Why can't we just let this be past? Why do you have to keep bringing up old history? Why are we even talking about this? Well, first off, this is a history channel. You came to me, not the other way around, buddy. I have genuinely had people in the middle of a historical museum ask me, why do you want to bring up old history? But also, the transatlantic trade has a massive impact on the world we live in today. There are ports that wouldn't exist, cities that would have stayed villages. In Africa, systematically having the fittest young men.
So you heard that there are ports that would not exist without these slave traders, cities that would still be towns, X, Y, Z. So the impact on the growth of, you know, Western economy, you know, it's undeniable. You know, slave money, basically helped to fund the growth of a lot of what we know today as modern Western civilization. Let's go.
In today, there are ports that wouldn't exist, cities that would have stayed villages. In Africa, systematically having the fittest young members of society constantly kidnapped and taken to other countries is a massive detriment to the African economy. Although certainly some African elites benefit from the trade, the result of removing so many working-age people from the country for hundreds of years is to send the economy of the whole continent into stagnation. It is still recovering from today. and to weaken the region to the point where in the 19th century it can be colonized by European countries which previously hadn't been able to penetrate into the interior of the continent.
Okay, so for anyone who thought that the Europeans colonized Africa any earlier than the 19th century, there you have it from your own brothers and sisters. Yeah, and for anyone who thinks they done it so easily, there you have it. You understand? Any questions, any more questions, you know, feel free. Maybe on the next show you can jump on and ask questions live if I feel like they're worthwhile. I think at the moment I don't think there's any questions that interesting that I really want to bring anyone on to talk right now. So without further ado, I'm gonna end the stream, but I'm gonna do we're gonna play you out with another track of mine. And it was nice having you. Thank you. Have a nice evening. Bless up, everyone. Indestructible, no filters on me now. I'm just trying to be intellectual. They talk about me, I've been around that foolish, different kinds of bullshit. I got no involvement, but they don't even know it's my progress. Indestructible, no filters on me now. I'm just trying to be intellectual. They talk about me, I've been around that foolish, different kinds of bullshit. They don't even know this, but I got no involvement. I'm ghosted. You don't want to see the ting turn mad. Don't want to see the ting turn Gaza. South London, the ting turns Mazza. So it's best you keep the ting carper. Big particular, get your ting car up. When I roll up in a coupe park up, she was chasing status. I was on my Jason Statham, everything Parker. When I come to my house on the freaking stop right there. That's the next chapter. DBZ, that's the next saga. Right now I got the ting pon start up. Right now I got the ting pon set up. Tune got bill up, foot got lift up. Take it to the dance floor, gal get have up. Get wine low and your back got bent up. Don't do video, man, get jealous. Talking that hater bullshit, don't tell us. If it ain't about money, I'm not that zealous. Ain't got numbers, so they can't bell us. Plus, we're indestructible. I'm not provocable, you're provocable. I'm deciding to. Don't talk about it, we ain't on that bullshit. They're about this talking. They was cool in road names, but they don't even know them. They're posing. Indestructible, no filters on me now. I'm just trying to be intellectual. They talk about me, I've been around that foolish, different kinds of bullshit. I got no involvement, but they don't even know it's my progress. Indestructible, no filters on me now. I'm just trying to be intellectual. They talk about me, I've been around that foolish, different kinds of bullshit. They don't even know it's but I got no involvement. Alright then. Send love to my family, friend them. Cause we never did a thing half-hearted. Send love to our daily departed. Trust you don't want to get me started. And if you're not a friend, you're a target. Certain man cop the thing and they blast it. I guess I'm all gone up and I'm past it. But every week I see bodies in caskets. See bodies on pavements in plastic. I guess nowadays everyone's ratchet. Nah, that's a misnomer, you're misled. It's just one bag of talking, they chat shit. Real criminals get locked down, kids. And real gangsters don't talk about it. These rappers will talk like they're doing the stuff that they say in their rhymes, but I doubt it. Don't act hard if you ain't about it. You come around here, get your shit outed. On ends, I'm a star like David. High ratings, these bitches are pouting hard. I'm calling rummy while you're counting cards. Now I'm in charge. Fear no one, never doubting God. Skip the bravado. Enough men are sitting in cages. On road cause they didn't like wages. We was all doing shit at them ages. When you're grown up, everything changes. So-called friends start feeling like strangers. Guess we were just going through stages. Now we're on Insta, going through pages. Like damn, I remember them faces. Certain places, been around the way, but now we're indestructible. No filters on me now, I'm just trying to be intellectual. They talk about me, I've been around that foolish, different kinds of bullshit. I got no involvement, but they don't even know it's my progress. Indestructible, no filters on me now, I'm just trying to be intellectual. They talk about me, I've been around that foolish, different kinds of bullshit. They don't even know this, but I got no involvement, I'm ghosted.